In a forgotten archive of small-town reports, buried under the weight of decades, lies a name that most have learned to forget. Yet the story attached to that name refuses to rot away. It is the kind of story that was whispered over candlelight, spoken as a warning, as though simply saying it aloud would invite something terrible into the room. The tale of a man who mutilated himself, not in anger, not in madness, but for one simple, haunting reason. He wanted to feel alive. Hi everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon before the story pulls you in too deep. The case begins in the early 20th century, in a small European village already weighed down by superstition and famine. It was a time when life was short, brutal, and often without meaning. This man, whose name I'll keep hidden for now, lived as a shadow among shadows. His life was marked not by extraordinary deeds, but by extraordinary silence. He worked, he walked, he ate, and he slept. Yet he confessed to neighbor, in brief mutters at the tavern, that he felt nothing. His words chilled those who heard them. "I am empty," he said once, "as though my blood no longer runs." Doctors, priests, and even fortune-tellers were of no help. In an era where science and faith wrestled for dominance, he seemed to belong to neither. And so, as rumors spread, so too did fear. Children were told not to look at him. Women crossed themselves as he passed. Men avoided his gaze, lest the void inside him catch and grow in themselves. He was a man who carried nothingness as a curse. But then, one night, the village heard the sound of a scream unlike any other. A scream not of pain, but of release. They found him in his small wooden home, face drenched in blood, clutching the jagged remains of a mirror. He had cut off his own nose with terrifying precision. When the villagers demanded to know why, his reply would haunt them all. "For the first time in years, I feel alive." The story might sound like madness, but history is littered with people who resorted to the unimaginable to break free from numbness. And this man's act was only the beginning of something far darker, an obsession with mutilation as the last frontier of sensation. When the villagers first saw him staggering through the narrow cobblestone streets, face wrapped in blood-soaked cloth, they recoiled as though they had seen the devil himself. The absence of his nose gave him a grotesque, almost mask-like quality, a living wound that demanded to be witnessed. Some claimed he smiled as he passed, though his lips barely moved. Others swore they heard him whispering under his breath, as if reciting a prayer no God would accept. The local physician, an aging man with trembling hands, agreed to treat him. Though reluctantly, he stitched and bandaged, muttered about infection, and warned that the man could very well die. But death was not his concern. "I have conquered death," he told the doctor. "I have felt it, and I have survived." That sentence alone spread faster than any rumor. Suddenly, he was no longer just a man with a deformity. He was a figure of myth, a walking reminder that some people will go further than others to break the barrier of human experience. But why the nose? The question troubled many. The villagers speculated endlessly. Some believed the nose, the organ of breath and smell, represented the root of human vitality. To destroy it was to prove dominion over the body's most primal instinct. Others whispered that he was possessed, driven by unseen forces that demanded blood as payment for sensation. A few even insisted they saw him afterward, crouched at his doorway in the dark, inhaling the air deeply, as though savoring the world in ways no one else could. The church called him cursed. They held midnight masses, prayed for the man without a face, and warned children to avoid his home. Yet curiosity overcame fear. People began to gather near his house, hoping to catch a sight of him. What they found was worse than what they imagined. He did not hide his wound. He embraced it. He sat on his porch in daylight, bandage as removed, letting the villagers gawk at the crater where his nose once was. Some fainted, others retched, but he only laughed. "You fear me because I dared to live," he would say. It was the kind of scene that history tries to bury, but the memory lingers. A single act of self-mutilation turned an ordinary man into a legend, one whose story was passed down not in medical journals, but in hushed tales told beside dying fires. And those who knew him swore that cutting off his nose was only the first step in a journey none of them wanted to witness. In the months that followed, the man without a nose became something more than human in the eyes of his neighbors. He became a mirror, reflecting back their own fears of emptiness, of futility, of being trapped in lives that bled together without meaning. They despised him, but they also envied him, for he had done what they could never dare. He had torn open the flesh to prove he still belonged to the world of the living. Strangely, he did not wither away as many expected. The wound healed into a permanent void, and he walked the streets like an apparition of pain. Children whispered ghost stories about him. Mothers used his name to discipline disobedient sons, and fathers warned their families that staring too long at him would invite bad luck. But beneath all the fear was fascination. What kind of man willingly mutilates himself to feel alive? Was it insanity, or was it the purest form of honesty? Old journals from the village describe how his behavior began to shift. He grew restless, wandering the countryside late at night, staring at trees and rivers with unsettling intensity. Witnesses claimed he pressed his fingers into the bark of trees until they bled, then smeared the sap on his face as if it were sacred paint. He would kneel by rivers and submerge his head in the freezing current, staying under for so long that onlookers believed he had drowned. But he always emerged, gasping, eyes wild, muttering words no one could decipher. The priest wrote in a faded sermon that the man seeks communion not with God, but with sensation itself. To the church, he had become a heretic of the body, a man who placed experience above the soul. And yet, the villagers kept watching. They followed him at a distance, drawn to his bizarre rituals like moths to a dying flame. Each time, he seemed to test himself further, scraping his skin raw, placing burning coals near his flesh, daring the world to extinguish him, and failing. And then came the whisper of a darker obsession. He began telling select villagers in hushed tones that cutting off his nose had awakened something inside him. A hunger, a need. Pain, he said, was the last truth in a world built on lies. And once you tasted it, once you truly embraced it, you could never go back. Those who heard him speak claimed their dreams grew restless, filled with images of mutilated faces staring back from the shadows. By the winter of that year, the man's story no longer belonged only to the village. Word traveled along trade routes, carried by merchants who described him with both horror and awe. A man with no nose, they whispered, who claims pain is the key to life. Soon strangers arrived, cloaked travelers who lingered in taverns, buying drinks and pressing locals for details. They wanted to see him, to witness the living relic of a tale that defied reason. The villagers who once feared him now found themselves charging small coins to point the curious toward his home. And so, his house became a grotesque shrine. He greeted these strangers not with shame, but with pride. He sat in his doorway, scar exposed, and spoke as though he were a prophet. The flesh is a cage, he would tell them, but the cage can be broken. Some laughed, some recoiled, but a few listened closely, their eyes wide with dangerous curiosity. It was in these encounters that something shifted. No longer was he merely a victim of his own compulsion. He was becoming a leader, though of what kind was uncertain. He spoke of the numbness that haunted mankind, the deadness that crept into everyday life, and the power of breaking free through suffering. The visitors took his words with them, spreading them like spores. And slowly, whispers emerged of others who tried small acts of self-harm, claiming it awakened them to life's raw essence. The local authorities grew uneasy. The mayor, a practical man with little patience for superstition, warned the villagers to stay away from him. "This is not faith," he said in a public decree. "This is disease." But decrees cannot erase fascination. In fact, they only deepened it. The more people were told to turn away, the more they leaned in, desperate to glimpse what they weren't meant to see. And so, the man without a nose began to believe his own myth. He was no longer just surviving. He was performing. Witnesses describe him eating iron nails in the fire until they glowed red, then pressing them against his arms without flinching. His followers, yes, by now they were being called that, watched in silence, trembling with both fear and admiration. Some fainted, some cried, but none could look away. For the first time in his life, he was no longer invisible. The emptiness that once crushed him had been replaced with something intoxicating, power. Yet power, born from pain, is never stable. It grows, it festers, and it always demands more. By the turn of spring, the man without a nose had crossed a threshold from curiosity to contagion. His home no longer resembled a dwelling, but a gathering place, a place where the air itself seemed heavy with dread. Villagers described the inside as dim and suffocating, the walls scratched with symbols that no one could decipher. Some swore they heard chanting when they passed by at night, though no church bell called the faithful to such meetings. Those who dared to enter described him as a shadow presiding over shadows. He did not stand tall or raise his voice, but the silence he carried had its own authority. He told stories of his emptiness before the knife, of how the act of severing his own flesh tore open not only his body but his soul. Pain, he told them, is the only door that does not lie. To the broken and the desperate, his words made sense. To the fearful, they were poison, and yet no one could deny his presence was changing the people. A farmer's wife was found with cuts along her arms, explaining through trembling lips that she only wanted to feel the world again. A young boy confessed to striking himself with a stone, whispering that it made him understand the man without a nose. These were not isolated acts. They were echoes, and echoes spread. The authorities grew alarmed, but fear restrained them. To arrest him would be to inflame his legend further, to give his story the crown of martyrdom. Instead, they tried silence. They forbade public mention of him, ordered that gatherings be disbanded. but silence only deepened the allure. What is forbidden becomes irresistible, and the man knew this. He leaned into it, smiling with his ruined face as people sought him out in greater numbers. By now, he had begun experimenting further upon himself. One evening, witnesses claimed he heated a blade until it glowed white, then held it against his palm. The room filled with the smell of burning flesh, but he did not scream. He only closed his eyes and whispered, "Alive." For his followers, this was no act of madness. It was revelation. The village, once ordinary and unremarkable, was sliding into something darker, a place where sensation became scripture, where pain became proof, and where one mutilated man became both prophet and warning. And history records that no village can remain unchanged under the weight of such a figure. The turning point came quietly, as such moments often do. One morning, the villagers awoke to find strange shapes carved into the trees near the river. Some resembled spirals, others grotesque faces with hollow eyes and jagged mouths. No one admitted to making them, but all knew whose influence lingered in the air. Mothers forbade their children to play near the water, though the children whispered that if they stared long enough they could see his shadow moving between the trees. At the same time, a strange transformation overcame those closest to him. His followers began to carry themselves differently, stoic, detached, as though they too had severed something inside themselves. They avoided laughter, shunned joy, and claimed that numbness was proof of weakness. When questioned, they repeated his words almost exactly, as if rehearsed. Pain is the only truth. To outsiders, it was unsettling. To the faithful, it was liberation. The mayor, in desperation, summoned the church. Priests marched through the streets with incense and holy water, demanding that the gatherings cease. They accused the man of heresy, of dragging souls toward damnation, but he did not resist. He only stood in the square, ruined face lifted to the sky, and let the people choose. Many spat at him, others knelt. The division tore the village in two, between those who clung to salvation and those who sought sensation. There are accounts of nights when screams pierced the air, not of terror, but of ritual. Witnesses claimed they saw figures pressing their hands to hot coals, others cutting shallow lines into their skin under his direction. And always, he spoke the same words. "You are alive now. You will remember this moment when everything else fades." For those who partook, the pain was not punishment. It was initiation. Yet even prophets are not untouchable. The authorities knew they could not allow his influence to grow unchecked. Plans were made in secret to seize him, to silence him, to erase him before the sickness spread further. But stories have a way of resisting force, and history tells us that attempts to suppress only fan the fire. He seemed to know this too. He told his followers, "If they take me, I will live on in your flesh." What began with one man and one act of mutilation had become something larger, something that no decree or sermon could contain. The village was no longer a place of ordinary life. It had become a stage for belief, obsession, and dread. The day of reckoning arrived under a gray sky, the kind of sky that hangs low enough to feel oppressive. The mayor's men, armed with clubs and chains, marched to the man's house with orders to bring him in. But when they forced open the crooked door, they found the place empty. The chair in the corner still smoldered from a fire. The walls still bore his the symbols, but the man himself was gone. Panic rippled through the village. Some whispered he had fled into the forest. Others claimed he drowned himself in the river, though no body was ever found. His followers insisted otherwise. They swore he had transcended, that he had finally severed not only flesh but existence itself. "He is in us now," one woman told the authorities, blood dripping from her palm where she had cut herself. The officials recoiled, but the villagers remembered those words for decades. Over time, the gatherings dwindled. The house collapsed into ruin. The scratch markings faded from the trees, and the church reclaimed its grip on the community. Yet the legend never died. Travelers who passed through the region spoke of a figure with no nose wandering the countryside, appearing at the edge of campfires, vanishing when confronted. Others claimed to hear his voice in dreams, urging them to break free from numbness in the only way he knew how. What is certain is that the story survived. It clung to the people like a stain that could not be washed out. Parents warned their children, "Do not seek him, do not follow his words, for once you taste the truth of pain, you cannot turn back." Still, some listened. Even in later centuries, isolated reports tell of men and women carving into their own flesh, whispering his phrases, repeating his rituals. His name never survived, but his influence became a ghostly inheritance. The man who cut off his own nose to feel alive was not remembered in books or monuments. His story lived in shadows, in whispers, in warnings. And perhaps that is more powerful than any written history, because legends that should be forgotten rarely die. They fester, waiting for someone desperate enough to listen. So if you ever feel that crushing emptiness he once described, and you find yourself staring too long at a mirror, remember the path he chose, and ask yourself, what would you be willing to cut away just to feel alive?